In my prejudiced view, Operation Market Garden was 90% successful. Those are the words of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, writing to King George VI just weeks after the battle ended. The 90% successful. Tell that to the men of the British 1st Airborne Division. 10,000 elite paratroopers dropped into the Dutch town of Arnhem with orders to hold a bridge for 2 days. And 9 days later, fewer than 2,000 of them made it back across the Rhine River alive. For the 8,000 men left behind, killed, wounded, or captured, that missing 10% wasn't a statistic. It was a massacre. This is one of the most controversial battles of World War II. Hollywood portrayed it as a bridge too far, a gallant gamble that just narrowly failed due to bad luck. But the truth is far darker. Market Garden wasn't lost because of bad luck. It was lost because Allied commanders, drunk on their own success, ignored intelligence, silenced dissenters, and sent light infantry to fight heavy tanks with little more than hope as a strategy. Today on WW2 Battlegrounds, we're dissecting the high price of hubris. To understand how this disaster happened, you have to understand the mood in September 1944. Following the breakout from Normandy in August, the German army in the West had essentially collapsed. British and American tanks were racing across France and Belgium, sometimes advancing 50 miles a day. The roads were lined with cheering civilians. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, appeared to be beaten, a disorganized rabble fleeing back to the fatherland. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, favored a broad front strategy, pushing everyone forward slowly and steadily. But Field Marshal Montgomery, the British commander, was impatient. He wanted a narrow thrust. He argued that if Eisenhower gave him all the supplies, specifically the fuel, he could punch a hole through Holland, cross the Rhine River, and drive straight to Berlin. He promised he could end the war by Christmas. And so Operation Market Garden was born. It was a 2-part plan, massive in scale. Part 1, Market. This was the airborne component. 3.5 divisions, the American 101st, the American 82nd, and the British 1st Airborne, would drop behind enemy lines. Their job was to seize a series of bridges along a single highway in the Netherlands. Part 2, Garden. This was the ground assault. The British 30th Corps, led by General Brian Urquhart, would drive their tanks up that highway, crossing the bridges one by one like rungs on a ladder, until they reached the final prize, the bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. On paper, it was bold. It was aggressive. It was exactly the kind of knockout blow the Allies wanted. But military plans live or die on intelligence. And in September 1944, Allied intelligence was shouting a warning that nobody at the top wanted to hear. This brings us to our first major failure, the willful blindness to intelligence. The plan relied on one crucial assumption. The German forces in the area were, quote, hold men and children. The belief was that the paratroopers would face crumbling infantry units with low morale. Enter Major Brian Urquhart. He was the chief intelligence officer for the British 1st Airborne Corps. A sharp, skeptical professional, Urquhart didn't buy the victory fever. He began looking at aerial reconnaissance photos of the Arnhem area, the drop zone for the British 1st Airborne. What he saw made his blood run cold. Hidden under the trees near Arnhem, clearly visible in the photos, were tanks. Not just any tanks. These were the distinctive shapes of Panthers and Tigers. The Urquhart realized that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, specifically the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions had been pulled off the front line to rest and refit, and they were refitting exactly where the British paratroopers were scheduled to drop. Now, a refitting Panzer Division isn't at full strength, but a weak Panzer Division still has tanks. Paratroopers have rifles and light machine guns. If you drop light infantry on top of heavy armor, it's not a battle, it's an execution. Urquhart rushed these photos to his superior, Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. Browning was a polished, elegant officer, desperate to see his airborne army in action. When Urquhart showed him the tanks, Browning didn't cancel the operation. He didn't change the plan. Instead, he dismissed Urquhart. He essentially told the major that he was suffering from a nervous breakdown and needed a rest. Urquhart was sent on medical leave. The photos were ignored. The existence of the Panzer Divisions was scrubbed from the briefings. Think about that for a second. The command structure was so obsessed with launching this operation that they physically removed the man who tried to save them. When the British paratroopers dropped on September 17th, they weren't met by old men and children. They were met by SS Grenadiers and armored vehicles commanded by Wilhelm Bittrich, a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front. The British were outgunned from the moment their boots hit the ground. While the British were fighting for their lives in Arnhem, the garden part of the operation, the ground relief force was running into a disaster of physics. The plan called for 30th Corps to drive 64 miles in roughly 2 to 3 days. But look at the map. They had to move 20,000 vehicles down one road. This wasn't a superhighway. It was a narrow, 2-lane Dutch road, elevated above marshy polder land on either side. The Americans, with dark humor, would later call it Hell's Highway. If you drive a column of tanks down a single road, you have a tactical problem. The enemy doesn't need to destroy the whole column. They just need to destroy the lead vehicle. And that is exactly what the Germans did, repeatedly. Small teams of German infantry, armed with Panzerfausts, their version of a bazooka, or anti-tank guns, would hide in the woods, wait for the British column, and blow up the lead tank. The moment the lead tank burned, the entire column, stretching back for miles, had to stop. Then the British infantry had to dismount, clear the woods, push the wreck off the road, and restart the advance. This happened over and over again. The timetable for Market Garden was built on best-case scenarios. It assumed no breakdowns, no traffic jams, and minimal resistance. In reality, 30th Corps was moving at a crawl. Meanwhile, 60 miles ahead in Arnhem, the clock was ticking. The British paratroopers had carried only enough food and ammunition for 48 hours. They were told 30th Corps would be there by then. Tuesday came and went, no tanks. Wednesday, no tanks. Thursday, the paratroopers were fighting with knives and grenades, drinking water from radiators, waiting for a relief column that was stuck in a traffic jam 20 miles away. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a failure of operational planning. General Stanislaus Sosabowski, the commander of the Polish Parachute Brigade, had warned about this. He famously looked at the plan and said, "But the Germans, General, what about the Germans?" He was ignored too. The tragedy of Market Garden culminated at the Arnhem Road Bridge. This was the final objective. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, leading the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, actually managed to reach the bridge. He had about 740 men. They seized the northern end of the bridge and dug into the houses overlooking the ramp. They expected to hold for 2 days. They held for 4 days and nights. What Frost and his men endured is the stuff of legend, But it's also a testament to the horror of modern warfare. They were completely surrounded by the SS. The Germans brought up tanks and simply began demolishing the houses the British were hiding in, floor by floor. The British had PIATs, projector infantry anti-tank weapons. It's a spring-loaded weapon, heavy, short-ranged, and difficult to reload. To knock out a Tiger tank with a PIAT, you have to get within 50 yards. Imagine that. You're in a crumbling brick house. A 60-ton Tiger tank is pointing its 88mm cannon at your window. You have to lean out, aim a spring-loaded tube, and hope you hit the tracks, because your round will just bounce off the front armor. By the third day, the British were out of water. They were out of morphine. They were running out of ammunition. The radio systems, another failure of planning, didn't work in the built-up city. So they couldn't call in artillery support, and they couldn't talk to the aircraft dropping supplies. The RAF flew brave resupply missions, flying straight and level through flak to drop canisters. But because radio contact failed, they didn't know the drop zones had been overrun. The British paratroopers watched from their basements, crying with frustration, as the supplies they were dying for landed directly into German hands. The Germans were literally eating the British rations and shooting the British ammunition back at them. Finally, on the morning of September 21st, after the houses were burning around them and the wounded were piling up in the cellars, Frost's battalion was overrun. They hadn't surrendered. They had simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A few miles away, the rest of the division, trapped in a shrinking pocket at Oosterbeek, held out for another 5 days before finally evacuating across the river at night. They left behind their wounded. They left behind the doctors who stayed to care for them. The elite 1st Airborne Division had gone in with 10,000 men. It came out with under 2,200. It never fought as a division again for the rest of the war. So what does this disaster teach us? First, it's the ultimate lesson in victory fever. The Allied command structure wanted the war to be over so badly that they stopped fighting the enemy in front of them and started fighting the enemy in their imagination. They imagined the Germans were beaten, so they planned for a beaten enemy. Field Marshal Walter Model, the German commander, proved that the Wehrmacht, even when wounded, was a dangerous animal. He reacted with speed and ruthlessness that Montgomery simply didn't anticipate. Second, it highlights the danger of a top-down culture that silences dissent. A Major Urquhart had the truth in his hands, photographic evidence of tanks, but because that truth contradicted the master plan of the generals, he was removed. When an organization punishes people for bringing bad news, it is destined to fail. The strategic impact was severe. The war did not end by Christmas 1944. It dragged on for another 8 months. The north of the Netherlands remained under Nazi occupation through a brutal winter, known as the Hunger Winter, where 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Civilians who had hung out flags to welcome the Allies in September, only to see the Allies retreat. Let's go back to that quote from Montgomery, the 90% successful. He argued that they had captured the crossings at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. They had liberated a corridor of Holland. Technically, they had achieved 90% of their geographic objectives. But in war, as in bridge building, a bridge that goes 90% of the way across the river is not a bridge. It's a pier, and you cannot drive tanks across a pier to Berlin. Market Garden was a gamble played with the lives of men like John Frost, General Sosabowski, and thousands of young paratroopers. They did everything that was asked of them. They fought with a courage that stunned even the SS officers fighting against them. But courage cannot overcome bad geography, bad intelligence, and arrogant leadership. The tragedy of Arnhem isn't that the plan failed. It's that the men on the ground knew it would fail, tried to warn their leaders, and were sent anyway. If you found this analysis of Operation Market Garden valuable, please leave a like and subscribe to WW2 Battlegrounds. We're dedicated to exploring the tactical reality behind the history books. Here's a question for you to debate in the comments. Was Montgomery unfairly judged for this operation, or should he have been removed from command for the failure at Arnhem? I want to hear your thoughts. Next time, we're going to look at the other side of the hill, how the German army, supposedly broken, managed to pull off one of the greatest defensive miracles of the war in the Horgen Forest. Until then, remember, history is written by the victors, but the lessons are often found in the defeats.